back in the room. How are you? 3 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are about to make radio history by opening a conversation about the, I suppose we have to say, the latest defeat for Western forces in Afghanistan, with a quote from Mike and the Mechanics. That is the side project, as you well know, of the Genesis guitarist Mike Rutherford. And if you were listening to their classic album, The Living Years, many, many more years ago, in fact, than I care to remember, must be in the region of 30 or so, then you may remember a line from the classic track Seeing is Believing, which went something like this. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing it, and I'm not going to play it either. Can't afford the royalties. Something like this. I believe in the magic of the Mujahideen. Now just think about that for a minute. This was a mainstream, middle-of-the-road rock outfit. I hope I'm not quoting them out of context, but the point still stands because, of course, the West supported the Mujahideen. In fact, if you can cast your mind back to Alan Wells winning the 100-metre sprint at the Olympic Games in Moscow in 1980, you'll remember there weren't any Americans there. Now, far be it from me to suggest that might have contributed to his glorious gold medal victory, but the reason why there weren't any Americans at the Moscow Olympics in 1980 is because the Russians were in Afghanistan. They'd invaded Afghanistan, and the Russians' enemy was an organisation, if you like, called the Mujahideen, a fairly ragtag group of people who were backed with weaponry from us, if you like, loosely speaking, the West, to fight against the Russians. Fast forward 30 years, it was the other way around. And you had the Russians objecting to the fact that the Americans had invaded Afghanistan and were fighting a group not called the Mujahideen this time, although I think it's fair to say that there was a sort of progress, a historical progress from one to the other. They were now fighting against the Taliban. And the Taliban enjoyed support from enemies of the West in the same way that the Mujahideen had enjoyed support from enemies of the East. And then you, of course, remember that Rudyard Kipling poem from about 1895, don't you? I'm not going to be able to dredge up the lines exactly from memory, but it was the bit about, and if you were to fall on the plain in Afghanistan and the women come out to chop up what remains, the utter futility of engaging in military escapades in that part of the world. Even carry on up the Khyber, if you want to really reach for the hat-trick of cultural references after Mike and the Mechanics, Rudyard Kipling, and now the Carry On films. Even Carry On Up the Khyber made a fairly compelling case for the utter futility of engaging. Rambo, you're right, was also on the same side as the Mujahideen. So it's madness, right? Sometimes. Thank you for all your kind words of welcome back as well. I think in recent years I've become a little bit too interested in the role that my own holidays play in your life. But I do occasionally allow myself a couple of words of explanation of what changes in my mind when I'm not waking up every single morning wondering what we're going to talk about today. And not having a strong opinion is the biggest difference, of course. And I do worry, as you know, that we're living in a world where everybody wakes up like radio hosts do now. You have to have a strong opinion about everything, whether you're on social media or whether you're just having a bit of a ding-dong with your mates or your colleagues. Everyone's got to have a strong opinion about everything. I suspect most of us are pretty ignorant about the bones of the Afghan conflict. I, for example, was slightly ashamed to clock that I hadn't registered that the original Doha deal that Mike Pompeo signed involved freeing 5,000 Taliban prisoners at a time when the number of American troops on the ground in Afghanistan was a fraction of that. Actually freeing 5,000 prisoners. I guess by that point perhaps we'd become so saturated with the depravity of that particular regime that we'd stopped clocking the latest despicable things or strange or bad or potentially dangerous things that they'd done. That said, coming out of Afghanistan remains, I think, quite popular in America, albeit that Joe Biden has had an absolute shocker, tactically speaking, left with an appalling hand of cards. It's fair to say, it's impossible to imagine him, however bad the hand of cards he was left with might have been, it's impossible to have imagined him playing it any worse. But what have we learned? What have we learned? Well, I think something quite significant might have happened, and this is where I'd like you to begin your contributions to the programme today. It's just a few comments collectively creating this idea. One former diplomat on Sky News put it particularly well about the end of that era of liberal interventionism. So there's two things going on in my mind this morning. The first is the absolute madness. And The Living Daylights, thank you. Yes, The Living Daylights, the James Bond film. See, the cultural reference points that should have prepared us for what has happened in Afghanistan over the last 2 weeks are almost too numerous to count. But the two things going on in my mind are the absolute madness of being there in the first place. How many people, honestly, hand on heart, can remember the full rationale? Post-September the 11th, Osama bin Laden was supposed to be holed up in the Hindu Kush. Remember the line about a 6'5" Arab on dialysis? Can't be that hard to find. It's quite a popular line at the time. Didn't find him until essentially after. And he wasn't in Afghanistan when they did. So that was the original rationale for doing it. Different, I think, to the arguments for going into Iraq. I mean, you could see that the architects of the September 11th terror attacks deserved to be chased into the fieriest pits of hell. But that was the rationale for it. And yet, as we now withdraw, humiliated and defeated from that theatre, he's a distant memory, and the Taliban that is now assuming control were only ever a shelterer of Osama bin Laden, as opposed, I think, to a part of his empire, if you like. So the madness of the entire engagement is almost too epic to contemplate. Inevitably, I'm going to invite you to contemplate it. But the other thing I want to do is this, and I don't know quite how to phrase this, because you don't want to be the... Well, first of all, you're conscious of the temptation to shoot the messenger when the news is ugly or the news is bad, but also... You know, even those of us who don't spend our lives terrified and cowed by the thought of footballers taking a knee or National Trust Properties publishing history of National Trust Properties, even those of us who are much more secure in our sort of emotional health and indeed in our relationship with geography and history and even patriotism, you kind of don't want to be... You don't want your country to be on the downslide. I know that's odd, given that a lot of the upslide for the UK hinged upon empire and colonialism and all those things we've been talking about all year. And it seems odd then to say, I don't want to be on the downslide, when the downslide involves essentially a surrendering of all those historical injustices. But we are, aren't we? The idea now, what if, and I don't know why it is, it might be inevitable, it might just be numbers, it might not be an opinion, it might just be counting the rise of China, the incredible infiltration, if you like, of Russia into so many corners of geopolitics, and, of course, the financial decline of the UK and, to a slightly lesser extent, of America, hinged upon the fact that we don't essentially root around the world looting and helping ourselves to resources. We are simply not going to be the power that people my age grew up still feeling that we were. I'm 50 in January, for the record. That's odd, right? And that, for me, translates into a question about perhaps the moral high ground is the phrase I'm looking for, perhaps the world's police force. And I think there's a bit of humble pie about to be served up as well, because plenty of people have been arguing for some time that it was either ridiculous or wrong for us to see ourselves as having the right to intervene in other countries, as having some sort of God-given right to march into foreign lands and tell the people living there what to do and how to behave themselves, to import or export democracy, if you like, or liberalism. And a lot of people have had a problem with that for quite a long time. The suggestion that the fall of the Berlin Wall marked a period of history where Western powers, led by America, with, I think, although I'm just as guilty of being a bit rose-tinted on this as the next man is, with the UK in the passenger seat, with the UK in the front passenger seat, not ruling the world, but believing in a right to reframe other countries, using military power. Do you get it yet? As I say these words out loud, is it sounding as weird to you as it does to me? We grew up, you and I, in a world where our country felt qualified, if not compelled, to march into countries on the other side of the world and overthrow regimes. Always, of course, in bed with America, and thanks to Harold Wilson's particular political acumen, not on the most humiliating defeat of them all, the Vietnam War, which Wilson, I think very courageously looking back now, kept us out of. But this idea that, and this is tough for me, I want to make it personal because I'm going to ask you to be a bit personal. I quite liked thinking that we occupied some sort of moral high ground. I quite liked that feeling. It may even have involved a sort of low-level racism, perhaps, or a sort of post-imperial exceptionalism. I quite liked the idea that my country was teaching the world how to be free, how to be liberal, how to be equal, how to be fair. I wonder this morning whether it ever really was. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. What are we learning? Is the lesson that a significant period of 20th and 21st century history is over? The United Kingdom and the United States will not, perhaps ever again, be in a position to tell foreign regimes to sling their hook, to march into countries that some of the soldiers and some of the journalists covering the stories would, 6 months ago, have struggled even to spell. We march into countries because we believe we have some peculiar brand of politics and liberty that qualifies us to impose or inflict or introduce it to people who never really asked for our help in the first place. You can choose whatever verb you please: impose, inflict, introduce. I would like to speak to some soldiers today. I don't know whether you ever wrestle with these issues. I don't imagine you can afford to when you're in the actual theatre of war. But if we are to learn anything from this, is it a humiliation? I mean, we've lost a war, really, haven't we? We went to Afghanistan to crush the Taliban, impose a government, introduce, defend a supposedly democratically elected government, and they fled. The most chilling thing for me on a personal level was seeing the newsreader with armed Taliban soldiers behind him on television, on live television. It would literally be like, admittedly this is the radio, but there are still cameras in here. It'd be like Keith saying, "Oh, James, there's just someone coming into the studio in a minute. Try and stay calm." And then two fellas walk in carrying Kalashnikovs or AK-47s and grenades. Turns around their belt. I go, "Keep talking, O'Brien." I go, "All right, you are. Yeah, okay." And I'm talking to you live on the radio with two heavily armed people behind me. I nearly said goons. I nearly said terror. I don't know. Got as much right to be in Afghanistan as anybody else has, and probably more right than we ever did. So that's the question. What are we learning? What is the major lesson for you, whatever your perspective may be, whether you are Afghani yourself, Afghan, I beg your pardon. Afghani is the currency, I think. Whether you're Afghan yourself, whether you've got a military connection with the country, or whether, like me, you just watch it with an ever-growing sense of wonder and confusion. What is the lesson? 0345 6060973. And if you want to start by picking over the bones of my suggestion is, that's it. Game over. The era of America with the United Kingdom right up there, front and centre, policing the world, is over. I don't know why. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think it's going to be pretty hard to refute. Discuss. The number you need, as ever, is 0345 6060973. You can tweet me at Mr. James OB. You can text 84850. But that, I think, is the question that we'll start with. Not a question I'd have asked if I'd been here every day for the last 2 weeks, but a question that's been forming in my mind from not having to have a strong opinion about everything every morning. This is, I think, a really significant moment. For as long as I can remember, conversations we have about international relations, about geopolitics, about movements, have all hinged upon, or have all contained a presumption that we are the good guys and that we will go where we are needed. Do you think that's over? 0345 6060973 is the number you need. Hit the numbers now. We'll talk after this. 20 minutes after 10. I wonder if it's a bit like being deprogrammed when you leave a cult. This sense, and I wasn't entirely sure which way the direction was going to go this morning, but I am a middle-aged man, a middle-aged British man who has spent pretty much his entire adult life believing that we're the good guys, and when there is really bad stuff going on in the world, we go in and sort it out. That sounds naive to the point of absurd this morning, as the Taliban confirm that they've taken Kabul airport and billions of pounds worth of American ordnance as well, which may prove to be something of a concern in the coming months and years. And Joe Biden, I think, subscribes or seems to subscribe, and the more you read up about him and the differences between him and Obama, the more sense this makes, that it's not America's job to deal with this sort of stuff anymore. And if it's not America's job, where does that leave us? Brent's in Derby. Brent, what would you like to say?
Well, I've got a philosophical point on this because I'm a history teacher and I currently teach this too. I asked the children a couple of years ago to choose a new history curriculum.
Oh, yeah.
And they unusually chose Afghanistan, and they chose the Middle East, so the Iraq War, the Gulf War, which was a lot better for them than, say, for instance, the history that I'd have been taught and you'd be taught. That'd be the Vietnam War, the Cold War.
Well, I think you'll find, Brent, it was the Carolingian Empire, actually, and the rise of Byzantium under the Emperor Charlemagne that I studied at A-level, so I think your point stands.
Well, yes, absolutely. Well, you had a very different education than I had. So I had James Connolly and all the 1916 stuff going on.
Fair enough.
But certainly, taking a longer look at it, this is a decline of the West. This is really the point where the East rises and the West falls.
Correct.
And there's something poetic about it in the sense of you take the rise of the Western civilization, democracy, Alexander the Great. And you take that, Alexander the Great went over there, and even he retreated. But he hastened in the rise of Western liberal democracy, Western values. But now we've seen the retreat of the modern version of Alexander the Great, the people who see themselves as the
I don't know. I mean, the more my era than 20th century history, but I don't know. I don't know that Alexander the Great fits into the category of sort of liberalising force. He was pretty brutal. And it wasn't much fun to be conquered by him. So I'll just park that as a pedantic point, but take the fall of the Berlin Wall as a starting point rather than perhaps Alexander the Great. And that idea that we, almost emboldened by the victory in the Cold War, then decided, well, we're going to sort out everyone else in the world as well. That's in retreat, right?
Oh, that war on terror operation. I mean, the irony is that the original going into Afghanistan was called Operation Enduring Freedom.
Yes,
I've not heard that mentioned. That name's just gone down because this idea of bringing, we will build a nation, we will make it secure. That whole experiment of spreading American values around the world, it seems to be in retreat. And the same goes for British values as well. The British Council's not getting funding. Our soft power. Britain has lost its soft power. It's losing it hand over fist with the likes of, not doing the likes of the funding for overseas aid. You're seeing a lot of examples of this. And here you have one example, for instance, of us lecturing China about, for instance, Hong Kong, while you've got facial recognition software being used against protesters in London.
Yes. I mean, again, I'd rather take my chances in London than I would in Hong Kong. But this notion of having a kind of inviolate moral supremacy is palpably ridiculous and probably always was, although that's quite a bitter pill for many of us to swallow. What do your young students make of it? Because they don't have this emotional connection to, I'm afraid I'm going to have to call it, a sort of post-imperial exceptionalism. I didn't realise I suffered from it, but it turns out I do. They don't, because they're too young, I imagine.
Of course, when they're given all of the information, they look at it from taking a step back, and they can see the oil, they can see the interest, they can see, for instance, I suppose sometimes kids are good at spotting the lies. So when you look at the propaganda, show them, for instance, the anti-war campaign of 2003,
yes,
and say, right, and then, I let them judge. And here, ironically, one of them turned around. I was an anti-war protester in 2003 myself, and I don't bring my politics into the classroom. But they come to the conclusion and say, well, those guys were right. And I'm sitting there with trying not to smile and go, yeah, I was one of the guys in 2003 thought this was a bad idea to invade Iraq, Afghanistan.
Again, if those two campaigns had gone better, then we would be having a very, very different conversation. And you didn't know when you went on that march any more than anybody else did what would transpire, but the moral argument hasn't changed. The result doesn't change the morality of it. Even if we had somehow successfully installed a stable democracy in Iraq and in Afghanistan, the moral argument, well, I don't know. Maybe the ends would have justified the means, but no one can claim that they can. I'd enjoy sitting in one of your classes, Brent, because it sounds a lot more interesting than my Charlemagne studies. 26 minutes after 10 is the time. Remember, if you want to grab a phone line, the best time to do it is when I bid farewell to one caller. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Be more positive if you want. If you don't like this suggestion, and I think Joe Biden fits into this categorisation, but it doesn't mean it's right, that America and therefore the UK have sort of really lost any claim to the right to march into other countries and lay down the law to change regime and what have you. 03456060973. Thomas is in Exeter. Thomas, what do you think?
Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Welcome.
None of our systems are perfect.
True.
But I think having America and England, or the rest of sort of Europe and the Western countries, policing the world and being the place where other countries can turn to, I think is better than the possibility of having Russia and China as the people who police the world with their...
I don't know if you'd say... I'd probably agree with you, but I don't think I would if I was a Kurd in Syria, for example.
Well, my point to that is how many of those people try to travel to us? How many of those people try to travel to the West, through Europe, to England? They do value our way of life more than they would value...
Well, again, there's a lot more people staying there than there are coming here. But I think as British people, Thomas, we have to cling to the idea, and most of the evidence supports us. You wouldn't want to live under the bloody Taliban. Under any circumstances, however bad things are in a system where you can chuck out the government at the next election. But that's different from thinking we've got the right to go into those countries and start telling them what to do.
I think we only have the right if the situation escalates to a point where we think the common person is under constant threat and worry and they can't go about their daily lives.
Well, then we'd be back in Afghanistan tomorrow, wouldn't we?
Yes.
Yes.
Because what is the other alternative?
To lead them to it, which is exactly what we're doing.
But how can... If you look at a case of like Ethiopia with famine, that's a natural occurrence, or it's a man-made occurrence that happens. Dictators and terrorists are a man-made occurrence as well because of what we've done in the past.
I think the humanitarian argument for intervening on a famine is very different from sending soldiers to kill people in a country where they were born.
Kill people or defend... If you look at something like Afghanistan that is completely tribal, so many different groups, just because we've put it in the square and gone, OK, that's a country, there are so many people in that country that...
So we stay there forever?
Don't want anything.
Do you think?
That is where I wouldn't know.
I mean morally, we're speaking in a theoretical moral universe, morally you would, I think, say we have to stay there forever, even if we are bringing people back in body bags for another 100 years. We have to stay there because we are right. We are somehow right. Our values, our morals, our Judeo-Christian outlook upon the world is somehow right. And that's, well, it's pretty arrogant.
It's not right. It's not right. But
what is it then? What's the word?
It's
better.
It's the best alternative.
Which means we choose to live under it, but it doesn't, I don't think, and this is all very much a work in progress, for me personally, and for you as well, I sense, but we choose to live under it and we'll defend our right to do so is not the same as saying we decide that you will too.
But if you look at the number of people, I know, as you said, not everyone chooses to leave, lots of people stay, but there is a mass migration of people moving out from these countries that are ruled horrendously, despicably.
Well, no, but again, there's lots of people living there who like it. You know, if you're in favour with the despicable regimes, you like living there. That's why people like Assad, I think, stay in power. I don't know that a refugee exodus is proof that we have the right to go into other countries and change the regimes. I think it's a powerful argument for doing more to look after these people. I'm sure they'd much rather be given a home and a job than have a mortar blast through their sitting room in the name of looking after them. But that perhaps is a conversation for a little later in the week. 10:30 is the time. Thomas, thank you. Kabul has fallen. It sounds like a Hollywood film. Think back 20 years, 30 years, 40 years and look at the toing and froing of loyalties and military engagements in that benighted part of the world. It's actually surreal. I'll say it again. America boycotted the 1980 Olympics because Russia was in Afghanistan fighting against a native rebel force. That one was called the Mujahideen. Now America has fled Afghanistan having been defeated by a native rebel force. That one is called the Taliban. Madness, I think, unless you can make some sense of it. And what have we learned? What's the big lesson for me? Cautiously, reluctantly, and very sadly, and a bit sort of shamefacedly. I wonder whether we were kidding ourselves for the last 10 or 20 years about just how important and how powerful and how entitled we were to get stuck into fights like this. 10:31 is the time. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. 10:34 is the time. I think Kosovo probably deserves a mention. I think that played a big part in certainly Tony Blair's thinking when it comes to marching into other countries and fixing stuff. I think he was looking for a hat-trick, wasn't he, after Rwanda and Kosovo. But as we contemplate this astonishing retreat, the scale of it was actually known. The scale of it was fully expected. It's the speed of it that has shocked everybody. Dominic Raab this morning, astonishingly, seeming to try to pass the buck to his own intelligence services or to the government's intelligence services. We shall see what happens to him. It's going to be interesting. I was away, as he was, when the fall of Afghanistan began. I didn't come back from my holiday, for the record, because I'm not Foreign Secretary. Tom's in Brighton. Tom, what would you like to say?
Oh, thank you. You just mentioned Kosovo.
Yes.
That was the slogan of the time was humanitarian intervention.
Yes, it was.
That was a warmed-over version of the old stuff about taking up the white man's burden, the imperial mission, which justified the British Empire. It was wrong 150 years ago. It was wrong 20 years ago. It is wrong now.
Obviously, the average Kosovan would completely disagree with you, but your point stands.
Let me continue.
Well, I will, but remember, this is a conversation.
Yes, okay, understood. My main point is we must relearn the lesson that was learnt after the Suez Crisis and put in practice by the Wilson government in the 1960s, and that is to withdraw all British troops from east of Suez. That was controversial at the time, but it was utterly vindicated. It was respected by every subsequent British government until John Major took part in the first Gulf War in 1991. Tony Blair professed to be an admirer of Harold Wilson as Prime Minister, but he completely ignored that.
I don't have the history to challenge you. I don't have particular desire to challenge you either. I think what you're saying is true. Hang on, I'm just establishing my own ignorance compared to yours, Tom. So for the benefit of other listeners, just in case anyone is shouting at the radio, I have no cause to challenge you.
Yes.
What was the rationale behind no troops east of Suez? I can see the obvious answers to that, but
well, it was the debacle of the Suez Crisis in 1956. Britain no longer had that imperial heft.
I see. So the lesson they learned when America told the UK and France to get back in their box, the lesson that should have been learnt then was that we are no longer players on the world stage on anything like the scale that we were previously.
It was not the one that should have been learnt. It was one that was learnt, not only by Wilson, but before that by Harold Macmillan.
Yes.
In decolonising very quickly in the early 1960s, I'm old enough to remember that. That was part of I was a little boy at the time, and it was part of my political education.
Right. Gosh.
But also, the counterpart of it was that Britain is a European power, very important European power, but our influence lies in close cooperation with our closest neighbours. And that meant membership of the EEC, subsequently the European
37
Union.
minutes back after my holiday, and I think the B word is about to appear.
This is British strategy.
I know it is. I know it is.
Nonsensical slogans about global Britain and that sort of post-imperial rubbish.
Yes. So do you think this will be a moment? I mean, you speak of a government that seems to sort of put pointless rhetoric and now demonstrable nonsense ahead of learning important lessons. So I don't know where the line is between what the country learns from this and what the government learns from this, but there is a profound lesson here somewhere.
I think the lesson was learned 10 years ago.
Right.
Do you remember the vote on intervention in Syria?
Yes.
Cameron wanted to go ahead with it. Parliament said no.
Yes.
His intervention in Libya was very unpopular, not much spoken about because they were ashamed of it.
Because it went so badly. And what's the last one that went well? I mentioned Kosovo. I think I mentioned Rwanda when I meant Sierra Leone, so we'll correct that without too much fanfare.
Kosovo at least was in Europe.
Yes. And it wasn't east of Suez.
I was actually working in Russia at the time, and the Russian attitude, I thought I learnt a lot from that, and I was rather sympathetic with that action. I'd also been in Serbia during that war and had no time at all for Milosevic.
No.
whether it was the right thing to do it as it was done in Kosovo, I don't know. I honestly, as I wasn't in the country at the time, I didn't hear all the
And then
debate.
finally, Tom, this idea, and I appreciate the history of it is where it will probably
we
lead
need to
you.
see it in historical perspective, like the Irish teacher that you spoke to earlier in the break. Yes.
And yet political power, particularly under the current government, seems to hinge in large part, even perhaps depend upon the continuing notion of this post-imperial exceptionalism, as if we are still somehow, as one sort of exchange that we have come very close to the B word, but the Brexit defenders now have moved on to, I can't believe that they're treating us, the UK, like a third country. I can't believe that the European Union is treating us like a non-member, like every other country in the world. We surely would have got special treatment, special dispensation. And I'm not even criticising or insulting that worldview. I can sympathise with it. I can understand how you arrive at that point of view. But that's why I think it is right to knit it all together. We're not. We're special in the way that family is special, but we're not special to anyone else's family in the way that we're special to ourselves. And that, it's never been clearer on some of the Brexit stuff. Aden, Yemen, Oman, Roger in Brentwood points out, might have been flies in the ointment of Tom's theory, but that idea that I grew up with, I don't know why, I'm not a saber rattler. I get very sentimental, I get very emotional about military service. As you know, I feel very deeply about how poorly we look after the mental health, for example, of veterans, never mind housing and issues like that. I have probably a slightly commando comic attitude to these brave men and women who do things I could never imagine myself doing. And maybe that's part of my problem, why I've always thought, well, we must somehow be on the side of righteousness. We must be on the right side. Maybe there are no sides. Although, if you could wave a magic wand, I think most of us would remove the Taliban from the equation entirely, in the hope that something would move into the space created that was more kindly and more decent and less brutal, less savage. The misogyny, the astonishing sexism, the homophobia, all of the things that we in this particular corner of the British media hold very valuable, although often, I spend my time arguing with people from my own country who don't hold those things very valuable. I would want to replace that sort of regime, but could I send your sons to do it? I don't know. 10:41 is the time. And daughters. Michael is in Southgate. Michael, what would you like to say?
Yes, hello. Yeah, I'm really at the beginning of this story. I worked for the Bosnian government in London when Bosnia wasn't recognised by the UK government as a state in the early days of the break. It would just be about 1990, something like that. And we were lobbying the UK government very hard for military intervention in the former Yugoslavia, really to stop the genocide that was taking place then in Bosnia.
Yes.
And the British government was very, very reluctant to get involved.
Why?
Well, I don't know. I'm going to guess, and I can't prove it. I'm sure somebody knows more. I think what the position was that they felt that the Soviet Union or Russia had suffered a huge historic defeat with the fall of communism, the loss of Eastern Europe.
Yes.
And that they wanted to establish good relations, understandably, may I say, with the former Soviet Union, and they're basically supporting Bosnia against sort of emerging. I mean, Serbia, that was really, I don't know if the client state's the right word, but Serbia is Russia in Europe in many ways.
Sure.
So basically...
So they just, they didn't want to, make things even worse for Russia. They wanted to restore some form of diplomatic relations with Glasnost era Russia, going in for that. Okay,
yes.
okay. And then along came Putin.
And I think there was also, I think now I look back, the people I used to meet much more right than I realised when I was young. It's like, your dad, as you get older, you realise how much more sensible he's become, I
love that line.
I think they were also, they knew more about it than I did, which I think is reasonable if you work in the Foreign Office. And I think there's probably some reluctance. We didn't know, well, I didn't know anyway. There were probably, I'm not looking for the word, they're basically sort of Mujahideen sort of units operating in Yugoslavia at that particular time. And I think there was a kind of reluctance also to get involved in anything that might entail supporting them. And it was this. I mean, I think it was.
Well, it's very similar to Syria, the way that you describe it, actually, Michael. You've taken me up to the break, but you've given me plenty of things to think about. And I think the region, my friend Ibrahim's been in touch, I think the region in northwestern Syria is called Rojava with a J, Rojava, which there are calls now for that to be recognised as an autonomous region. It's where the Kurds have essentially seen off ISIS, but America and Britain still declines or refuses or fails to recognise that as an autonomous region, which would, of course, upset Assad enormously. And Assad is, to bring us back to Michael's point about Bosnia and Serbia, Assad is very much supported by Vladimir Putin's Russia. But as Ibrahim points out, America and Britain are happy to let the Taliban take over Afghanistan, but they still refuse to formally recognise areas in Syria where ISIS was defeated by Kurds. Again, for all sorts of reasons. This idea that in concert with America we were somehow big enough and rich enough and powerful enough to waltz in and fix things. I'm beginning to think, we began the programme by suggesting it's out of date now, that lesson has been learned. I think the callers have created a very, very strong case for arguing that this lesson should really have been learned at least 50 years ago. No troops east of Suez. Problem is, of course, all it takes is an irresponsible or even a corrupt politician to start banging the drums of war, and all this stuff gets thrown out of the window in a sort of fervour of furious patriotism. And far be it from me to suggest that the current government might be given to stoking up fervours of furious patriotism. I think we could look over the Atlantic at the last fella in the White House and see a fascinating dichotomy between someone who'd stop at nothing to support his own position, but Donald Trump clearly, he said so, thought that soldiers were stupid. Couldn't believe anyone would sign up to do military service. The idea of protecting some bearded mullah on the other side of the world with American blood, I mean, his mind was absolutely unthinkable. But even a stop clock is right twice a day. Joe Biden, I think, feels pretty similarly about this is not our business anymore. I wonder how you feel about that. I still, for the record, don't know how I feel, but I'm very surprised that the conversation we've had so far this morning sort of speaks to an idea that either you're in support of us doing it, but you're not entirely sure why, just because it feels right. But the more you think about it, the harder it is to come up with those arguments. Take that as a challenge if you wish. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 10:46. 10:50 is the time. It is an almighty mess. Make no mistake about that. How much of the mess could have been avoided or alleviated with better leadership, with more clarity and leadership, dare I say, we probably will never know. But it's pretty hard to believe that things couldn't have been done better, and that the scale, the speed, rather, of the fall of the Afghan government could have been foreseen. And you just, again, you look at other countries. I think France were certainly more au fait with what was likely to happen than we were. I think they were. I'm just like you. I'm one pair of eyes. Trying to find threads and themes, but I don't think that the argument, we had no idea this was going to happen, which is clearly going to be punted by the White House and by Downing Street, I think that is far from unassailable, let us say. And speaking of unassailable positions, this idea that we have, or the official figures of the number of people left behind, they are eminently assailable. MPs reportedly scrambling to rescue more than, wait for it, 7,000 constituents and family members trapped in Afghanistan. This figure dwarfs the only estimates that have been provided by the government of the number left behind. I'm speaking, of course, about people here, human beings, as opposed to cats and dogs, which I gather has also been a fairly strong news story. I wonder whether that would happen in any other country in the world. I don't know, but I don't want to talk about that yet. I want to continue talking about people. Call me weird. Scores of Labour MPs inundated with pleas for help from thousands of constituents whose relatives have been left stranded since that final emergency airlift left Kabul following this incredibly precipitous fall to the Taliban. That's a story that's going to develop. I imagine some of the weaponry left behind, it won't be quite as bleak as first estimates might suggest, because my friend Guy Walters, who's a very good historian, pointed out on Twitter yesterday that it'd be like leaving a Formula One car in our garage. some of this stuff. Me and Keith couldn't just hop into it and start driving it around. We'd be wrapped around the nearest tree before you could say Lewis Hamilton. So although some of the stuff they've left is clearly, like Humvees and armoured trucks and stuff like that, is clearly going to be usable, but the really high-tech stuff that's been left behind is unlikely to be deployed effectively or immediately, but that's going to be a big hangover. But whose hangover is it? That's really the question that's underpinning our contemplations this morning, isn't it? Whose hangover is it? Why is the situation in Afghanistan our problem? And that, of course, is the inevitable upshot of asking, why was it our problem? 0345 60 60 973. It was our problem originally because of September the 11th. But that was a long, long time ago. 10:53 is the time. Huma is in Welwyn Garden City. Huma, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Thanks for letting me talk. Please bear with me. I will try my best not to become emotional. My voice is shaking because I still cannot come to terms to believe what has happened is reality. For the past 3 weeks, I wish that somebody would wake me up and say it was a very, very bad nightmare. But as time goes on, it feels like it's not a nightmare, it's happening. 20 years ago, on the first Taliban invasion, I fled the country as an Afghan and was made refugee to the United States. Stayed there, lived there, studied there. I then moved on. I'm now in England, living with my family, and cannot believe what I'm witnessing 20 years on. Trillions of dollars, millions of Afghan and Western soldiers' lives. So much investment into the country, only for American government or politicians to replace Taliban with Taliban. It is unbelievable.
Was it not inevitable? I mean, listen, I'm not going to challenge you on anything you say because this is your life and it is not mine, really. But 20 years, to see the advances made in 20 years removed so quickly, does, I think, leave the door open to the question of how long would it have needed to create an Afghanistan that America and its allies could safely withdraw from? And how many more battles would have been fought?
Absolutely. I do agree that the West should not and would not have stayed there forever. However, the so rapid withdrawal and the fall of the government overnight was nothing that anybody could expect. The Doha deal was a huge mistake.
Yes, clearly.
To bring back the very terrorist group we were fighting against.
What did you feel when that was signed? Because that
was an absolute mistake,
and it didn't really get reported in terms, did it? Here, I don't know why. Whether or not we'd been bombarded with madness from Donald Trump, that we just didn't clock it properly. But looking back, that was incredible. It
was incredible. It was unbelievable. But the sudden withdrawal, America went in to liberate Afghanistan, to bring human rights, to restore human rights and to bring back democracy to the country. But by the shameful withdrawal, they shot humanity in the face. They tortured human rights and threw democracy out of the window to the same sea they buried Osama bin Laden.
So how long should they have stayed?
They could not. I'm not arguing with them staying forever. What I'm very heartbroken by is they handed over 35 million innocent Afghans to the same terrorist group. With this withdrawal, at least they could have. They could have got rid of the Afghan government if they were inefficient, but they could not turn over the whole country into the hands of terrorists.
What could they have done different? I don't want to hector you. And you may not be able to answer this question, but I can't, and I can ask you. You know a lot more about it than I do. And I think we have to say post-Doha, because we're asking what Joe Biden could have done differently, and that deal was signed. Taliban members those prisoners had been released, those pledges had been made.
Absolutely.
So post-Doha, what could have been done differently this month?
James, you and I know America can do anything. They can change things overnight. They could call the Doha deal null and void.
Right, but that's an act of war from the Taliban's point of view.
Of course it is. They could have. I mean, by bringing this terrorist group, America has called their own defeat. This is not a war that was won. This is a shameful war that was miserably lost. And lessons learned. I wouldn't want to talk about us lessons learned, but lessons learned for Afghans, I would say, is
go on.
Unless they unite with themselves and save their own country, they should not expect anybody else to save them. They should not expect the Western governments to bring democracy. They should not expect...
You're from there, so, I mean, I'm a lazy Western journalist who just says something at this point about tribal societies, and the likelihood of that kind of unity ever being achieved is zero, and there's hundreds of years of evidence to suggest that's local warlords and what have you, tribal chieftains going back centuries. So my understanding, which is scant and naive, is that what you've just described is never going to happen.
Well, as I said, yes, I think anything is achievable unless they unite with each other, unless they put their differences aside. We have some of the very corrupt politicians as well, to be honest. Afghans do. We are giving so many sacrifices as a result of these corrupt politicians who have built buildings, who have bought houses, mansions,
we've seen the
outside
pictures.
the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's golden tap territory.
Exactly, and they see their own people lead these days. Look at the airport scenes. It is heartbreaking in the 21st century. I'm heartbroken. I go to bed with a mountain of pain and responsibility on my chest. I hear cry of people, my own relatives, who call me for help and who think I can help them. I can't. It's a miserable few weeks that have passed, and it will be. We will live with this
only just begun
for a long time to come.
I've got nothing to add to that. I'm so sorry for you and for yours, and of course for your country, and even even as I say those words, I'm conscious of perhaps flirting once again with that notion of Western excess. What right have I got to feel sorry for your country? Answer: you're from there. You've just told me what it's like, and that's all I can go on today. Thank you, Huma. It's 11 o'clock.